crossed the sacred threshold of my own home, the faint, sweet effervescence of ceremonial champagne still clinging subtly to the heavy wool of my service uniform, while the soft, trusting warmth of 8-year-old Maya's small fingers remained anchored securely within mine. The promotion ceremony at the base had concluded only an hour prior, and deep within my heart, I carried a fragile, quiet hope, a cherished vision of stepping into the sunlit hallway to find David waiting with that familiar, swelling pride in his eyes, ready to celebrate a monumental milestone 2 decades in the making. Instead, an unsettling, unnatural stillness hung suspended in the air, dense and cold enough to prickle against my skin like an incoming winter frost. Outside, the porch light burned brightly against the afternoon sun, casting a harsh, artificial glare across the wooden entryway, a subtle, jarring anomaly that my trained tactical eyes instinctively registered long before my conscious mind could fully process its ominous meaning. There was no fragrant aroma of dinner drifting from the kitchen, no joyful greeting echoing down the corridor. Only a heavy, hollow quiet that felt distinctly manufactured and rehearsed. Beside me, little Maya paused, her small shoes squeaking faintly against the hardwood as her tiny thumb stroked my hand, sensing the sudden shift in our home's atmosphere before her innocent mind could articulate the threat. I squeezed her delicate fingers reassuringly, taking a measured breath to center my pulse. Yet every instinct honed over 22 years of military service whispered that the sanctuary I thought I was returning to had already been silently breached. I stood in the doorway of my own life, smelling of victory, while the house itself seemed to recoil under the weight of an impending, quiet storm. Looking down at the newly pinned silver eagle glistening brightly on my collar, a quiet, overwhelming rush of 22 years surged through my memory. Each sturdy thread of the navy fabric woven with sacrifices that only a soldier truly understands. This rank was not merely a prestigious title bestowed by rigid military protocol. It was paid for in the hard currency of missed birthdays, reheated Thanksgiving dinners consumed over glowing computer monitors half a world away, and milestone anniversaries celebrated through static-filled satellite phone calls. It was earned in the blistering dust of dangerous overseas deployments and through the agonizing discipline of learning to sleep soundly through distant mortar fire, only to face an even harder battle upon returning home. Learning to navigate the suffocating silence of an empty house when the adrenaline of war finally faded away. That very morning, the commanding general had pinned the eagle onto my shoulder himself, holding my handshake a beat longer than regulation required, while looking into my eyes with profound, unyielding respect, earned in shared hardship. "Colonel Miller," he had said, his deep voice carrying the undeniable weight of shared battlefields. "You earned every single thread of this rank the hard way." I had thanked him with genuine humility, but my heart had already raced ahead to this exact moment, longing to share this sacred triumph with the man who had promised to be my lifelong anchor. 22 years of quiet resilience, of burying tears deep within my soul so I could stand tall for the soldiers I commanded, had culminated in this shimmering piece of silver, a testament to enduring grace under fire, selfless service, and unwavering dedication to duty. Stepping further into the open kitchen, the lingering warmth of my hard-won triumph withered instantly against the bleak reality waiting on the white quartz island, where a thick stack of legal divorce papers was fanned out like a gloating hand of winning cards. Standing casually beside the counter was David, his posture stiffly assertive, and right next to him stood Chloe, a younger woman immaculately draped in a tailored beige blazer, her sharp eyes brimming with rehearsed arrogance and poorly disguised amusement. David did not look at the silver eagle gleaming brightly on my collar, nor did he offer a single word of congratulations for a career milestone that had cost our family over 2 decades of endurance. His gaze was entirely hollow, fixed on me with the cold detachment of a strategist who believed he had successfully orchestrated an inescapable trap. Beside him, Chloe adjusted her posture with the casual, possessive grace of a new homeowner, her painted lips curved into a subtle, triumphant smirk that suggested she had spent days practicing this exact confrontation in her mirror. The crisp papers between them sat like an official, physical declaration of war, their stark black ink attempting to erase 11 years of marriage before I had even hung up my coat. David stood tall, reclaiming the floor with the unearned authority he always assumed when trying to master a room, completely oblivious to the fact that his carefully staged ambush was being observed by a woman who had spent a lifetime reading battlefield topographies far more treacherous than a suburban kitchen. Before I could utter a single word, Chloe took a deliberate step forward, her sharp eyes sweeping over my crisp service uniform with a mixture of patronizing pity and cold contempt that felt like a calculated public slap. "Pack your bags, soldier," she purred, her voice dripping with a condescending sweetness that cut violently through the quiet room, smiling as if she had spent the entire morning anticipating the sheer thrill of delivering that cruel sentence. David stepped up directly beside her, his voice dropping into a flat, dictatorial register as he added his own final verdict. "The house is mine after the divorce, Sarah. You can take your personal belongings and leave. I'll be reasonable about the furniture." Beside me, Maya's tight grip tightened into a desperate, trembling squeeze, her small body leaning heavily against my hip, as her young mind struggled to comprehend the sudden hostility directed at her mother. I felt the sharp, protective surge of maternal instinct flare within my chest, accompanied by the deep, icy stillness that always takes over a seasoned soldier when an unexpected ambush is sprung in dark territory. For 11 long years, David had mistaken my quiet nature and gentle demeanor for weakness, convincing himself that my long deployments and disciplined silence meant I was easily outmaneuvered, a passive, naive participant in my own life. They stood there together, bloated on false confidence and cheap theatricality, hurling insults at the uniform I had bled for, blissfully unaware of the unshakable foundation beneath their feet. Instead of exploding into the tearful rage they had so clearly braced for, or creating an agonizing, hysterical scene that would forever scar my young daughter's fragile heart, a profound, unshakable calm settled deep into the center of my bones. I looked at David, then at Chloe, and finally at the sunlit kitchen they so prematurely claimed as their own, and a soft, almost gentle smile touched my lips. It was the same deadly, absolute stillness I had mastered in high-stakes command briefings, where a single emotional misstep could cost human lives. A stillness born not of defeat or shock, but of absolute, unquestionable tactical clarity and quiet strength. They were celebrating a grand victory in a war that hadn't even officially begun, standing proudly in the center of a home they believed they had conquered, utterly blind to the legal and moral ironclad reality beneath their polished shoes. "Okay," I said, softly, my voice perfectly level and serene, carrying the quiet, undeniable authority of a leader who already controls every single piece on the chessboard. Chloe's triumphant smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of uneasy, instinctual confusion crossing her sharp features as she struggled to read the complete absence of fear or anger in my eyes. They genuinely thought they were evicting a weary, defeated soldier. They had absolutely no idea whose ground they were standing on, nor the quiet, devastating storm that was about to dismantle their comfortable illusion, piece by piece. Without uttering another word to the spectators in my kitchen, I took Maya by her small, trembling hand and led her quietly up the carpeted stairs, away from the toxic atmosphere below. In the sanctuary of her bedroom, surrounded by soft pastel walls and childhood drawings, I crouched down to her eye level, keeping my expression perfectly serene and reassuring. Together, we gathered her essentials into her favorite backpack, her worn plush rabbit, a cozy cardigan, and an unfinished watercolor painting she had proudly brought home from art class that very afternoon. "Are we leaving, Mommy?" she whispered, her wide, anxious eyes searching my face for cues on how frightened she ought to be. "Just for tonight, sweetheart," I answered softly, offering a smile that was anchored in unshakable truth, even if she could not yet grasp its full meaning. This was not a panicked retreat or a surrender born of weakness. It was a disciplined, tactical extraction designed to shield my innocent daughter from an ugly, unnecessary battlefront. A commander's first duty is always the preservation of her people, and I refused to allow my 8-year-old child to become collateral damage in a spectacle engineered by two deeply insecure adults. As I zipped her bag, I smoothed her golden hair, holding her close until her breathing stabilized. In that quiet room, amidst the innocence of her stuffed animals, I made a silent vow. No matter how vicious the storm outside became, Maya would only ever witness her mother standing tall, governed by dignity, grace, and an ironclad sense of purpose. Leaving Maya in her bedroom for a brief moment, I walked into the master closet and knelt before the small, fireproof safe bolted securely beneath the hardwood floor, a fixture David had never once asked about or acknowledged in 11 years of marriage. With practiced precision, I entered the combination and retrieved a thin, weathered manila folder. that had rested undisturbed long before David and I ever exchanged vows at the courthouse. As I stepped back out into the hallway, David was standing near the doorframe, leaning against the wall with the smug, condescending patience of a man who believed he had already won every hand in the game. Assuming the folder contained documents regarding our joint bank accounts or some desperate scramble to protect shared marital assets, he watched me with a quiet, arrogant smirk, not even bothering to ask what I held in my hands. I offered no explanation, no defensive justification, refusing to grant his inflated ego the satisfaction of an argument. Walking downstairs, I set my brass house key gently on the marble island right beside the spread of divorce papers, the metal clicking softly against the cold stone. "Enjoy your evening," I said evenly, looking past them both with an unreadable calm that left Chloe momentarily frowning in confusion. I stepped out into the twilight, shutting the door behind us without a sound, leaving them to celebrate inside a fortress they foolishly believed they had captured, completely unaware that they were merely occupying borrowed time in a home that was never theirs to claim. A short drive later, Maya and I checked into a quiet, modest hotel situated just outside the perimeter gates of the military base. Exhausted by the emotional turbulence of an unpredictable day, my daughter drifted off to sleep almost immediately, her tiny body curled up beneath the crisp white sheets, with her stuffed rabbit tucked securely beneath her chin. I sat alone by the wide window, looking out over the distant amber glows of the runway lights and the silent cityscape beyond. I did not cry for the marriage that had evaporated into thin air, nor did I allow grief to paralyze my resolve. 2 decades of commanding military operations had conditioned me to rigorously compartmentalize emotion from immediate action. Grieve later, execute now. Sitting in the ambient shadows of that quiet room, the logistics officer within me took full control, analyzing the tactical terrain, identifying vulnerabilities, and assembling a decisive sequence of countermoves. I pulled out my phone and began making a series of precise, strategic calls. First to Patricia Reyes, my trusted legal counsel, and then to a select few contacts who handled property management and legal filings. Each conversation was brief, methodical, and devoid of rancor, focused entirely on documentation, statutory enforcement, and swift execution. As I hung up the final call, a profound sense of clarity washed over me, displacing any lingering residue of betrayal or self-pity. The battle lines were drawn, the trap was set, and while the city slept peacefully below, the unstoppable wheels of justice were already set into motion. Back at 214 Ashford Lane, oblivious to the invisible legal machinery shifting around them, David and Chloe were celebrating as if the war had already been fought and won. I would hear about the details later, secondhand, the popping of a champagne cork echoing through my kitchen, arrogance raised high in toasts to a future neither of them had any legal claim to inherit. Chloe was reportedly walking through the quiet rooms with proprietary flair, running her fingertips along the mantel, critiquing the wall paint, and openly planning which of her own furniture would displace mine. David, riding the intoxicating high of believing he had finally outmaneuvered and humiliated the wife he considered overly rigid and plain, indulged her ambitious decorating dreams without a single word of correction. For over a decade, David had operated under a comfortable, self-fabricated narrative that he was the primary provider, the savvy real estate mind, and the dominant financial force in our partnership. He had convinced himself that my military paycheck was merely a modest, predictable supplement, routinely dismissing my military career as dry and unglamorous compared to the commercial deals he closed. In his spectacular arrogance, he had constructed an elaborate fantasy where his soldier wife was completely dependent on his generosity, entirely oblivious to the reality that his high status was an illusion built upon assumptions he had never bothered to verify. They drank their wine together in the quiet house, completely unaware that their grand dream had an expiration date measured in mere hours. The unshakable truth, locked safely inside my manila folder, had been forged long before David ever entered my life. Years earlier, while serving as a young captain stationed overseas, I had lived with rigorous financial discipline, saving nearly every cent of my hazardous duty pay, combat allowances, and deployment bonuses. Combining those hard-earned savings with a specialized Veterans Affairs housing program, I had purchased the modest 3-bedroom home on Ashford Lane through a quiet estate sale when the neighborhood was still undiscovered. I had poured my sweat, my deployment earnings, and my quiet determination into paying off the mortgage completely, clearing the deed 100% before I ever stood at the altar with David. When we married and he moved into the house, he simply assumed, because I never boasted, and because he never bothered to ask, that it was a joint marital asset, purchased together, like most suburban couples do. Under the ironclad property laws of our state, however, a residence fully acquired and paid for prior to marriage remains absolute separate property, entirely exempt from division in divorce proceedings. I had kept the original title deed and payoff documentation locked away, not out of malice or deceit, but as a quiet, sacred insurance policy forged by a single woman in uniform who understood that true security is something you build with your own hands. David had lived in that house for 11 years merely as a guest of my generosity, mistaking my quiet nature for ignorance, completely oblivious to the ironclad foundation beneath his feet. At precisely 9 o'clock the following morning, the quiet illusion David and Chloe had built so hastily came to a sudden, screeching halt. David answered the front door dressed in his silk bathrobe, holding a steaming mug of coffee, expecting a routine package delivery, or perhaps the morning paper. Instead, he was greeted by a crisp, professional process server who handed him a formal 3-page legal notice before turning and walking away without uttering another word. Prepared by Patricia Reyes, my veteran military family law attorney, the document laid out the cold, unyielding reality of statutory property law in plain, uncontestable language. It certified that the residence at 214 Ashford Lane was titled exclusively in the name of Colonel Sarah Miller, having been purchased and fully paid off prior to our marriage. Under state law, it did not constitute marital property, was not subject to encumbrance or equitable distribution, and carried no joint marital liability whatsoever. Standing in the bright morning sunlight, his coffee cooling rapidly in his hand, David stared at the notarized deeds and court seals, his face draining of all color, as the terrifying reality slowly sank in. The house he had so casually promised to his mistress, the asset he had used to anchor his inflated sense of wealth and superiority, was entirely out of his reach. In a single moment, 11 years of comfortable, unchallenged assumptions evaporated into thin air, leaving him clutching 3 sheets of paper that effectively rendered him an unauthorized occupant in a home he did not own. According to Maya's babysitter, who stopped by the house around noon to retrieve a forgotten school folder, the calm morning had erupted into complete chaos. Chloe had snatched the legal notice right over David's shoulder, her face turning pale before she exploded into a tirade of disbelief, shouting that it was an impossible mistake and demanding he fix it immediately. David, suddenly desperate and rattled to his core, tried calling my phone 11 consecutive times before midday, but I let every single call go straight to voicemail, knowing that some revelations are best processed in quiet, reflective silence rather than frantic confrontation. Back in the living room, where they had popped champagne only hours earlier, the celebratory atmosphere turned toxic as Chloe's rehearsed poise completely crumbled under the weight of sheer panic. The babysitter described hearing raised, furious voices echoing into the driveway, Chloe screaming and bitterly accusing David of misleading her about his wealth and social status, while David frantically tried to reassure her that his aggressive lawyer would find a loophole. But there were no loopholes to find. In an ironclad title deed, notarized long before David ever set foot in the house. Watching from afar, through brief second-hand updates, I felt neither spite nor petty triumph, only the quiet validation of a woman who had built her entire foundation on truth and patience. The fragile foundation of their relationship, constructed entirely on superficial promises and material ambitions, was already cracking under the very first test of harsh reality. By the time I finally returned David's call on the 4th day, every trace of the smug confidence he had displayed in my kitchen had vanished, replaced by an edgy, frantic desperation. "You let me think this house was ours!" he barked into the receiver, his voice trembling with a volatile mix of anger and humiliation, accusing me of calculated deceit, as if he were the innocent victim of an elaborate scheme. I took a slow, measured breath, keeping my tone perfectly calm, serene, and sharp as a razor blade. In 11 years of marriage, David, you never once asked whose name was on the deed, I replied evenly, refusing to let his elevated blood pressure disrupt my inner peace. You never asked about the purchase date, the mortgage payoff, or the title records. You convinced yourself of a story that fed your own ego, and I simply let you live in it because it was easier than arguing with your pride every time I came home from deployment. He went completely silent on the other end of the line, the weight of my words pressing down on him, because there was no logical defense to offer. For over a decade, his authority in our relationship had rested on the false assumption that he was the prosperous provider, and I was merely a passive bystander. Hearing the absolute truth laid bare stripped away his remaining defenses, forcing him to confront the unsettling reality that his entire sense of control had been built on nothing more than his own willful ignorance. As the days wore on, Chloe's fragile patience frayed completely, transforming whatever fleeting affection she had felt for David into sharp, biting resentment. Her unpacked moving boxes sat stacked inside the garage, remaining taped shut as it became increasingly clear that her grand lifestyle upgrade was evaporating in real time before her eyes. She had entered the relationship believing David was a wealthy real estate executive who owned a sprawling suburban home and enjoyed financial dominance, expecting a life of luxury, ease, and effortless social status. Instead, she found herself trapped in an embarrassing, high-stakes legal nightmare alongside a man whose impressive facade was crumbling by the hour. Neighbors later mentioned hearing heated arguments spilling through open windows, Chloe's voice sharp and mocking as she hurled bitter insults at David for deceiving her about his true financial standing. "You told me you were successful. You told me she was just some plain soldier who would be easy to push aside," she reportedly screamed during one particularly vicious, door-slamming exchange. David, accustomed to being admired and validated, was forced to endure the agonizing realization that the woman he had chosen over his family cared only for the wealth and prestige he could provide. As his grand promises dissolved into thin air, Chloe's adoration turned to disgust, revealing the hollow nature of a relationship built on vanity. David was discovering, in the most painful way possible, that when you build a house on sand, the first storm takes everything with it. Amidst all the turbulence, it was 8-year-old Maya who demonstrated a quiet, breathtaking maturity that touched the deepest corners of my heart. When David called later that week, attempting to arrange a visit and convince her to come stay with him, Maya took the phone from my hand with a steady, solemn expression. Holding the receiver tightly in her small hands, her voice remained small, yet unyielding. "I don't want to come stay with you right now, Daddy. I want to stay with Mom." I watched David attempt to argue gently, trying to persuade her with promises of ice cream and fun activities. But Maya stood her ground, with polite, unwavering firmness, repeating her decision without raising her voice or losing her composure. When she handed the phone back to me and rested her head against my shoulder, I felt tears of quiet pride sting my eyes. In that simple, courageous moment, I recognized the unmistakable reflection of my own resilience, alive within my daughter's spirit. She had absorbed the lesson not through lectures or words, but through observing her mother handle betrayal with dignity rather than theatrical rage. She understood, even at 8 years old, that true safety lay in integrity, courage, and unconditional love. As I wrapped my arms around her, holding her close in our peaceful hotel room, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, my daughter was growing into a woman of unshakable strength, grounded in the timeless truth that self-worth is never up for negotiation. 2 weeks into our separation, David experienced yet another rude awakening when he logged into our joint checking account, only to discover a remaining balance barely sufficient to cover a single month of basic household bills. Panic-stricken and deeply enraged, he dialed my number immediately, his voice rising in sharp accusation as he demanded to know where our hard-earned money had gone, fiercely accusing me of quietly siphoning away our shared accounts in the dark of night. I remained perfectly composed on the line, listening to his frantic, ragged breathing before calmly addressing his groundless paranoia. I explained in clear, measured tones that I had not siphoned away a single dime. The joint checking account held precisely what it always had, just enough funds to cover everyday groceries, utilities, and Maya's ongoing school expenses. David had simply operated for over a decade under the foolish, arrogant assumption that this shared account represented the full extent of my financial existence. He had deposited his own salary there and drawn from it for household costs, assuming without question that my financial contributions were limited strictly to whatever modest buffer remained in that single ledger. He had never once asked where the rest of my military earnings went, and I had never felt compelled to volunteer the information to a man who routinely dismissed my income as modest and insignificant. My disciplined military career had taught me to compartmentalize sensitive logistical details, even within my own home. I had stolen nothing. David was merely confronting the sobering reality that he had spent 11 years living alongside a woman whose true financial foundation he had never bothered to understand. What David failed to comprehend was that 15 years of managing complex logistical operations for the military had shaped my personal financial habits into an ironclad, unyielding discipline. Throughout my long career, every single dollar earned from specialized hazardous duty pay, combat zone tax exclusions, and overseas deployment stipends had been quietly funneled into low-cost index funds and dividend-yielding stock portfolios, rather than squandered on fleeting luxuries. 3 years prior, I had also purchased an unpretentious brick duplex near the military base, a highly reliable rental property that generated consistent, passive monthly income. None of these disciplined financial moves were shrouded in shadowy secrecy or hidden illegally in offshore accounts. Every investment, stock dividend, and rental gain had been fully reported each year on our joint federal tax filings. David, however, had spent 11 years signing those tax returns blindly, barely glancing at the numbers before scrawling his signature at the bottom, thoroughly blinded by his own vanity. He had been so utterly convinced of his superior status as the commercial real estate expert and primary provider that he viewed my official military paperwork with complete condescension, assuming my income was far too negligible to warrant his precious time or scrutiny. The financial records were sitting right there on our kitchen counter, year after year, fully disclosed and legally sound. His stunning ignorance was not the result of my deception, but rather the natural, inevitable byproduct of his own profound arrogance and stubborn refusal to acknowledge my true worth. When David's aggressive divorce attorney, Curtis, attempted to construct a legal claim demanding a 50% division of my rental duplex and investment portfolio as marital property, he slammed headfirst into an impenetrable brick wall. 10 years earlier, when David decided to launch his own independent commercial real estate firm, he had approached me seeking my full financial support for his risky venture. understanding the volatile, dangerous nature of private real estate liabilities, I agreed on one non-negotiable condition. We would execute a formal, binding post-nuptial agreement to insulate our family from potential business debts and catastrophic financial failures. To safeguard our daughter's long-term future, that legally binding agreement stipulated that all my pre-existing assets, deployment savings, and separate investments would be placed into an irrevocable trust established exclusively for Maya's benefit, with me serving as the sole trustee. Eager to secure my signature for his business loans and brimming with self-importance, David had signed the postnuptial paperwork without ever reading the fine print, casually dismissing my legal precautions as paranoid military overthinking. Now, a decade later, that very agreement rendered my entire financial portfolio completely untouchable under state property law. Curtis was forced to deliver the devastating news to his client that not only was the Ashford Lane house off limits, but my entire investment portfolio and rental property were legally protected inside an airtight trust that no court in the state could ever dismantle, leaving David with zero claim to my hard-earned assets. The realization hit David with the crushing force of a physical blow, shattering his fragile ego and dissolving the comfortable mythology he had cultivated for over a decade. For 11 years, he had anchored his masculine identity and marital authority on the smug belief that he was the more capable, sophisticated partner, the brilliant financial strategist who understood money and power, while his wife merely obeyed orders in a uniform. He had made careless, patronizing remarks over the years about my steady little government paycheck, secretly taking immense pride in his belief that I depended on his superior business acumen for our lifestyle. Now, the bitter truth stood revealed in cold, undeniable legal documentation. The wife he had dismissed as plain, rigid, and financially unremarkable had quietly outmaneuvered him in every measurable way, building an independent fortune without ever needing his permission, advice, or financial help. He was not the wealthy benefactor rescuing a simple soldier. He was an insecure man who had lived for over a decade under the protective umbrella of a woman whose true strength he had been too blind to see. The humiliation was absolute and suffocating, stripping away his unearned pride and leaving him utterly exposed as a man who had traded an extraordinary, fiercely protective partner for a shallow fantasy built on hollow promises, false vanity, and inflated self-regard. He was forced to confront the dark truth that he had destroyed his own home for an illusion that was now crumbling around him. Back at the Ashford Lane residence, the air grew thick with unspoken venom as the illusion of luxury completely dissolved, leaving behind a bitter wasteland of broken ambitions and endless regret. Neighbors began noticing loud, hysterical shouting matches erupting through open windows at all hours, Chloe's sharp voice dripping with venom as she realized her golden ticket had turned to dust. She had entered David's life expecting a grand lifestyle upgrade, a sprawling suburban home, and a wealthy executive husband who could fund her desires without question. Watching that glamorous illusion collapse in real time, discovering that the house belonged to the soldier wife, the joint accounts were empty, and David was facing a mountain of legal fees without a safety net, eroded whatever patience she possessed. Her unpacked moving boxes sat in the garage like monuments to her failed ambition, and her admiration for David rapidly turned into unmitigated disgust. She openly mocked his business failures and belittled his lack of foresight, realizing he was nothing more than an arrogant man living on borrowed prestige. David, desperately clinging to his remaining pride, fought back with equal bitterness, realizing too late that the woman he had left his family for possessed zero loyalty when the illusion of wealth vanished. The toxic relationship was rotting from the inside out, buckling under the weight of financial disappointment and mutual contempt, proving that a union built on deceit and greed can never survive the cold light of truth. The courtroom was smaller than television prepares you for. All muted beige walls, fluorescent lighting, and polished oak benches that hummed with a quiet, solemn gravity. I arrived early, as my 2 decades in military uniform had conditioned me to do, choosing to wear my official Army service uniform rather than civilian attire. I wore it not for dramatic effect, petty intimidation, or theatrical posturing, but because it represented my authentic identity, my decades of sacrifice, and the quiet dignity I had bled to preserve. The silver eagles gleaming on my shoulders and the rows of ribbons pinned to my chest were not props. They were a living record of every overseas deployment, every missed holiday, and every quiet victory I had earned through discipline. Minutes before 9, David walked in beside his aggressive attorney, Curtis, both clad in expensive, tailor-made suits that looked suspiciously brand new, the kind of clothing purchased specifically to project an image of prosperous authority, executive success, and dedicated family leadership. David carried himself with a stiff, carefully rehearsed confidence, attempting to project the demeanor of a successful businessman who had been unjustly wronged by an aloof, career-driven spouse. Yet, beneath the crisp, immaculate lines of his designer suit, my trained eyes could easily detect the subtle, nervous tension in his posture, the tight set of his jaw, and the fleeting anxiety in his eyes. He sat down at the defense table, avoiding my gaze, surrounded by pristine leather briefcases and stacks of legal motions, relying on tailor-made appearances to construct a fragile illusion of entitlement that was about to be put to the ultimate test. Judge Rebecca Hill entered the courtroom at precisely 9:15, her sharp, perceptive eyes taking in the room with the brisk efficiency of a seasoned jurist who had witnessed every possible iteration of marital conflict. When she reached my file, she looked up and offered a brief, respectful nod, addressing me clearly as Colonel Miller, a subtle acknowledgement of service that immediately set a dignified tone for the proceedings. As the arguments commenced, Curtis stepped forward to deliver a passionate plea, gesturing dramatically toward 11 years of marriage and arguing that David's payment of utility bills and minor household maintenance constituted an equitable contribution toward the home's accrued equity. He attempted to weave a persuasive narrative of shared endeavor, painting David as a dedicated partner whose indirect financial investments entitled him to half the property's total value, under broad principles of marital fairness. Patricia Reyes, my steadfast military family law attorney, stood up calmly, dismantling Curtis's emotional appeal with surgical, undeniable documentation. She laid out the original purchase contract, closing statements, title deeds, and official bank records showing the mortgage had been paid off in full nearly a year before David and I ever stood at the courthouse altar. Patricia demonstrated with flawless clarity that David's utility payments were merely the basic cost of his own 11-year residency, not an equity-building financial contribution. Every paper was immaculate, legally binding, and unambiguous, leaving Curtis with no statutory ground to stand on, as the physical evidence spoke far louder than any lawyer's clever rhetoric. Then, Patricia called our key surprise witness to the stand, Mrs. Eleanor Vance. The courtroom grew deathly quiet as the 80-year-old retired judge and real estate attorney walked slowly toward the witness box, relying on a polished wooden cane, yet carrying an undeniable aura of sharp intellectual power and commanding dignity. I hadn't seen Eleanor since the unforgettable day she handed me the keys to the Ashford Lane house 11 years ago, and seeing her now brought a sudden, warm swell of emotional gratitude to my chest. Taking her oath with a clear, resonant voice that filled the room, Eleanor settled onto the stand and looked directly at the judge. When Patricia asked her to explain the exact circumstances surrounding the original sale of the residence, Eleanor's stern expression softened with deep, reflective memory. She explained that she had owned the house for over 3 decades and had chosen to sell it directly to me in a private transaction, far below its true market value. I met Captain Sarah Miller back then through a specialized veterans housing initiative, Eleanor testified, her steady, articulate voice echoing off the quiet beige walls. She had just returned from her 3rd grueling overseas deployment, carrying a deep, quiet exhaustion that I recognized immediately because my late husband had come home from 2 tours in Vietnam carrying that exact same weight. I decided right then that I wanted to give her something secure, a real home, earned through true sacrifice, courage, and selfless service. Eleanor turned slightly, her piercing gaze sweeping across the quiet courtroom before locking directly onto David, whose face began to drain of all remaining color. I personally drafted every single line of that deed and closing contract, Eleanor continued, her voice firm, resolute, and commanding. I made sure it was structured as an absolute, unassailable, separate property transaction in Sarah's name alone, specifically so that no future circumstance or greedy individual could ever strip it away from her. She paid every single dime of the purchase price with her own hard-earned deployment savings before she ever even met Mr. Carter. Tears welled in my eyes as I listened to her words, hearing for the very first time the profound warmth and protective intent that had guided Eleanor's generous actions a decade earlier. Across the room, David sat completely frozen, his jaw slack and his skin the pale color of dry parchment, realizing that his entire financial claim had been utterly obliterated by the very woman who had created the title deed. Curtis sat in utter silence beside him, recognizing the total futility of attempting to cross-examine an 80-year-old former judge whose paper trail and testimony were completely bulletproof. There were no legal loopholes to exploit, no ambiguities to distort, and no emotional leverage left to wield. Eleanor's testimony had erected an ironclad monument of truth, leaving David's entire legal team completely helpless in the face of unquestionable integrity and historic justice. Judge Hill did not take long to deliberate, reviewing her legal notes with the swift, decisive cadence of a jurist delivering a clear and undeniable truth. Looking directly at the defense table, she ruled that 214 Ashford Lane was unequivocally separate property, purchased prior to the marriage, with documentation that left zero legal room for the marital claims Curtis had attempted to construct. She officially granted the divorce, confirmed the residence as solely mine, free of any encumbrance or financial obligation to David, and awarded primary custody of Maya to me, with structured visitation for David contingent on consistent, responsible fatherly behavior. She issued a formal court order granting David 30 days to vacate the premises completely and remove his personal belongings under legal supervision. David sat motionless as the final ruling was read aloud, staring blankly at the polished mahogany table, his posture completely collapsed under the crushing weight of his defeat. I gathered my legal files, turned toward Eleanor with a deep, silent nod of profound gratitude, and walked out of that courtroom into the bright afternoon sunlight, where Maya was waiting patiently with her grandmother, swinging her legs on a wooden bench. There was no wild triumph in my heart, no petty satisfaction in David's ultimate downfall, only a deep, serene sense of peace, healing, and absolute vindication. Justice had prevailed, my home was secure, and my dignity remained whole as I stepped forward into the clear light of our independent future. Chloe did not even wait out the 30-day vacate window. She packed her taped cardboard boxes and departed quietly during the very first week following the court's decisive ruling. Her moving truck pulled away under the cover of dusk, leaving David alone to pack up the remnants of a shattered fantasy under the uncomfortable, pitying gazes of curious neighborhood onlookers. His real estate career spiraled downward swiftly thereafter, as rumors of the messy public divorce, the attempted land grab from a decorated female military officer, and the stern testimony of an 80-year-old retired judge circulated through tight-knit professional circles. I orchestrated none of that public retribution myself. I never spoke to reporters, posted bitter words on social media, or slandered his name to his employers. 22 years in uniform had taught me that vengeance is an exhausting, heavy burden that ultimately consumes the person carrying it far more than the target at which it is aimed. The natural, inevitable consequences of David's own deceit, arrogance, and poor choices served as a far heavier sentence than any malice I could ever have devised. Watching him haul heavy boxes into a rented moving van on a humid Tuesday afternoon, I felt neither satisfaction nor petty schadenfreude, only a profound, lingering sadness for a man who had traded his family, his home, and his personal integrity for an illusion of wealth that dissolved the moment reality touched it. Some tragic falls are manufactured by bitter enemies. But the most devastating ones are entirely self-inflicted. The first weekend after David finished moving out, Maya and I drove to the local hardware store on a crisp, sunlit Saturday morning to pick out paint for her bedroom. It was an unplanned whim, a spontaneous decision born from her offhand comment that she wanted her bedroom walls to feel uniquely hers, rather than a room she had simply inherited. In the brightly lit paint aisle, her small finger traced over dozens of colorful paper swatches before settling decisively on a soft, pale green, the precise shade of tender new leaves emerging in early spring. We spent the entire afternoon rolling fresh paint onto our walls, drop cloths spread neatly across the hardwood floor, both of us clad in oversized military t-shirts, with green smudges liberally decorating our hands, cheeks, and hair. Maya wasn't particularly skilled at staying inside the lines, but I found I didn't care in the slightest. We laughed until our stomachs ached when she flicked a roller too enthusiastically and caught my left sleeve. There was a sweet, therapeutic healing in that messy, imperfect work, a quiet restoration that felt far more like home than anything I had experienced in 11 long years of trying to preserve a dying marriage. As the second coat dried under the warm afternoon sun, the house seemed to breathe again, exhaling the stale, suffocating tension of the past and inhaling the vibrant, hopeful warmth of a genuine sanctuary built on pure love, laughter, and new beginnings. Word travels fast in a suburban community like ours, and by the following weekend, the quiet, generous solidarity of our neighborhood began blooming on our doorstep. Neighbors brought over warm casseroles, freshly baked sourdough loaves, and spare furniture, offering practical support devoid of gossip or prying questions. That Sunday afternoon, several of my old military colleagues from the base drove out in their pickup trucks, work gloves in hand, to help me assemble a sturdy new wooden bookshelf for the living room. Among them was retired Colonel David Morgan, a veteran of 30 years of service, who stood in my newly rearranged hallway, watching Maya chase the neighbor's golden retriever across the sunlit backyard. He looked around at the peaceful house, turned to me with a look of deep, paternal pride, and said quietly, "Some people believe rank is earned exclusively on distant battlefields, Sarah. But true leadership, strength, and character are proven when a commander navigates the fiercest storms of life without surrendering her dignity, her honor, or her soul." His words settled deep into my chest, offering a quiet, profound validation that no official medal or military commendation had ever bestowed upon me. This victory was not achieved under someone else's command, orders. It was the quiet, deliberate choice to hold on to my integrity when everything around me was designed to strip it away, surrounded by a resilient, loving community that honored true sacrifice, courage, and quiet endurance. Several months later, a handwritten letter from David arrived in the mail, its neat cursive reflecting the quiet strain of multiple drafts and genuine reflection. He apologized without making excuses, acknowledging the immense pain his selfishness had inflicted, and expressing a sincere hope to eventually become the father Maya truly deserved, even if he had forfeited all right to be my husband. I did not respond with residual anger, nor did I reach out with false warmth or nostalgic regret. Instead, I wrote back 3 clear, measured sentences. I thanked him for his honesty, confirmed Maya's upcoming weekend visitation schedule, and wished him peace and healing in whatever chapter lay ahead for him. Some doors do not need to be slammed shut in rage to remain permanently closed. They simply need to be shut quietly, firmly, and left behind as you step forward into the life you are building. True forgiveness is not about declaring that the wrong committed was acceptable. It is about releasing the heavy emotional debt so it no longer dictates your peace of mind or controls your spirit. David was no longer my adversary or my emotional anchor. He was simply Maya's father, a man navigating his own difficult, necessary reckoning, while I walked forward into a future defined by absolute clarity, self-respect, unshakable grace, and genuine inner peace for myself and my daughter in the home we loved. That evening, after Maya had fallen asleep, exhausted from playing in the yard, I took the framed photograph from my promotion ceremony, the one I had brought home on the day everything fell apart, and hung it in the front hallway near the door. Underneath it, I placed the small brass key that had once sat beside divorce papers on my kitchen counter, serving not as a trophy of conquest, but as a silent testament to endurance, quiet triumph, and unyielding faith. Looking down the hall toward Maya's bedroom, where my daughter slept peacefully beneath the soft, pale green walls she had chosen herself, a profound, unshakable sense of freedom settled into my soul. The real victory had never been about retaining the house, keeping the money, or vindicating myself against those who had underestimated me. The real victory was the quiet sanctuary we had built within these walls. A home anchored in honesty, resilience, and unconditional love. True home, I realized in that golden twilight, is not constructed of brick, mortar, or legal deeds. It is the quiet, portable sanctuary of dignity, integrity, and self-worth that you carry within your own heart wherever you go. I had walked through the fire with my daughter's warm hand in mine, and as I turned off the hallway light, I knew with absolute certainty that we were finally, truly home in every sense of the word.